Our guest speaker today at the Bradford seminar is Andrew Bell, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. Previous to his position at BU, Andrew was assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at NYU. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan program in resource ecology and management with a certificate notably in complex systems, which he works on. And before that, he was at Santa Fe, where he... Andrew, did you learn about complex systems at the Santa Fe Institute? They're very... I did. Good. That's what it's for. He has a couple of degrees before that in environmental engineering, and he was a postdoc at Columbia's Earth Institute and the International Food Policy Research Institute, a very interesting place in Washington. So Andrew's self-described research interests include use of surveys, behavioral experiments, and agent-based models to understand decision-making in the areas of agricultural development, water management, migration, and livelihoods, all of which you can read about on his website. I met Andrew while he was at NYU, and we collaborated on a whole bunch of projects. And articles also around the development of his agent-based model, MIDAS, which he developed to cast light on the role played by environmental stresses, such as climate change, on household decisions about migration when there are other alternatives available as well. My experience with Andrew is that he asks interesting questions and finds equally interesting approaches to answering them, bringing new insights and new tools, importantly, to the topic of human responses to climate change. And I also want to say that he's one of the best people to collaborate with that I ever met. So congratulations to Nick, who's going to be taking up a postdoc there next with Andrew sooner, we hope, rather than later. The topic of this, the later, because I haven't wanted to get let go of Nick, so that's all my fault. The topic of his talk today is critical data gaps in climate change adaptation modeling. Please join me in welcoming Andrew
Bell. Introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I didn't have an adapter to click, so I'm going to have to be wandering back and forth. I hope that's not too much of a distraction.
And remember, no microphones, speak loud.
Right, okay. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, I'll speak as loud as... I've got this one here. I don't know if it's helping. I just want to... I was struggling to find a picture to put on the front, and some of you may know that we're in the midst of this AI revolution in art and coding and exam answers and all these cool things. And so I asked my computer to give me a picture of migration in South Asia with migration flows and people, and this is what I got. It was one of 30 different options. I really liked it. This is the one that I chose. I don't know a lot about AI. Particularly, I know all the machine learning parlor tricks, and I have a modeler's appreciation for what's possible at large computational scale. And I guess I bring this up to sort of say, looking at things like this sort of says we're at that computational scale now where our capacity to crawl and imitate across the internet is at this exciting place. And I want to come back to that a little bit later in the talk, because I want to be able to talk a little bit about what are we going to do in the spaces where we realize we just don't have and won't have good data as it relates to adaptation. So, oops, daisy. There we go. What I want to do, I want to talk a little bit about agent-based modeling with this framework called MIDAS, Migration, Intensification, and Diversification as Adaptive Strategies models that I developed some years ago with Michael. I want to talk a little bit about ways we've gone about finding good data to inform the model so that it's not just a silly toy, and what's hard about doing that. And then I want to talk just a little bit in the space that I don't know that well, about what we do to model when we don't have data to back ourselves up. And I will say, all of the literature and things that I talk about are all up here at this link, bit.ly/bell_C-PREE. So if I'm fumbling a little bit and you just want to get to what I'm talking about, it's all there in a folder you can download while we're speaking. So I'll start to talk a bit about MIDAS. So migration is a fun thing to try and model because we've been at it for a very long time. So going back late 19th century with the laws of migration and the gravity model of bigger places tend to attract more people. We started, but the thing about the radiation models and gravity models like this is that the unit of analysis is the place and not the person. And as time has gone on, as researchers and technical people, we've developed theory on the one hand, starting with Bogue in the 1960s, looking at migration as an individual decision and carrying on with additional contributions like the PPM theory or the push-pull mooring theory around decisions that people make. I'm pulled by things that are better where I am than where I am. I'm pushed by things that aren't great where I am. And I'm moored by sort of intervening factors of, oh, well, I own a car here and a house and I have family here and I can't make this work and I don't speak that language, and things that sort of kinetic barriers to keeping you in place. And as well, another notable and important theory, among many, I should be clear. There's a real breadth of different ways of thinking about mobility, but capabilities and aspirations is another individual theory that's bounced around for about 25 years or so now to help us think about the decisions that we make as being this intersection of what we want to do and what we can do. So in MIDAS, it's an agent-based model, and I guess I didn't throw in a slide here, but the basic idea of agent-based modeling is that we are modeling individual decision makers who are interacting with each other, interacting with their environment, and out of the decisions that they make emerge system-level properties that are of interest to us. So drivers interacting with other drivers, shaping traffic jams, voters interacting with other voters, shaping presidential outcomes, farmers interacting with other farmers, thinking about, are you clearing your land, am I clearing your land, shape sort of like rates of tree cover, sediment erosion into water, all kinds of individual up to system level interactions like that. So in MIDAS, we are looking at the emergent outcome of mobility, and we've treated it as agents in places, embedded in social networks with each other, agents in the same place as them, agents in other places, deriving utility from what we're calling utility layers in the spaces that they are. These are jobs, they're things they own, they're things that people enjoy. Maybe it's access to swimming pools, whatever it is. They're sharing resources with each other, they're sharing information with each other across their social networks, and they're periodically making decisions about what's the best portfolio of opportunities for me? What do I want? And if it's the case that they decide that a portfolio of opportunities somewhere else is the best thing for them, then they move. And so what I like about this, and what was helpful at the time that we built this, was that it was the first kind of simultaneous consideration of pushes and pulls and moorings. A lot of the other models that had been built sort of considered them sequentially. And what it also then allows is for migration, again, to be emergent rather than, we check to see if we don't build in the objective that an agent wants to migrate or not. It emerges out of their decisions about what's best for them. I'm going to step through a couple of slides of a little bit of the technical stuff under the hood in case it's of interest. Generally, we run in a sort of like a basic underlying time step, so it's a dynamic simulation moving through time, which is a little bit different than an equilibrium approach. And within that time step, we have some things that may or may not happen. So agents probabilistically might talk to each other. They might look around on the internet and learn things about the world. They might die. They might have babies. They might get married. They might do all kinds of things. And by varying those probabilities, we kind of capture the sort of, varying degrees by which people are communicative or not, or busy or not, or reevaluate their lives or not. And then underneath that, we have a set of things that just happen inexorably over time. Crops grow and get harvested. People earn money from their jobs. So kind of like a fixed base underlying time step on top of which we have things that happen probabilistically over time or not. Agents are making decisions about what they want in a boundedly rational way, meaning agents are not considering all the millions of possibilities for their lives that are out there. They're simultaneously considering a small number of portfolios, including what I'm currently doing, other things I thought about before that seemed like good ideas at the time, and maybe one or two additional random new ideas. And then they estimate what do I think the sort of future stream of utility might be from moving into this world, and then based on that, filling in the gaps as best as they can, knowing that they have incomplete information, they make decisions about what they might like to do. Now, I want to highlight one thing here because it's important, and it's sort of a point about the way we make decisions that kind of flies in the face of what we have data for. But imagining this is time, and these, and you're going to have to work with me here a little bit. We've got some really basic abstract drawings here. Think of these rectangles as history of your personal experience, if you will. So imagining we have things in our lives that shape our experiences and upon which we base our decisions at any given time. So our decisions at some point in time are shaped by some recent to not so recent history of experience. And as we move ahead in time, decisions later on are then based on some further kind of recent to not so recent history. But the key reason to highlight this is, this is not so far from how you probably imagine make your own decisions. It's really unlikely in any world that we have all the data that we need to inform this. When I start to run a model, I probably don't know everything that's happened in an agent's life to bring them up to where we are, and it can get us into trouble a little bit. So that's as much as I want to share for now about the details of this model. Again, if you want to dig in, all of the sort of details of MIDAS are there in this folder. But we had a nice application that came out a year or so ago where we had applied the MIDAS framework to looking at coastal migration in Bangladesh. We had a few rounds of income and expenditure data. We had a few rounds of inter-district migration data to calibrate against. And we also had some colleagues who were able to produce for us some projections of how we expected to see flooding change over the coming decades in response to climate change and sea level rise. And what was fun about this paper is we were able to show that with the model that we were able to construct for the impact of sea level rise flooding on agricultural and non-agricultural wages, while we did see damages to those two sort of categories of income, it wasn't enough to fully suppress the sort of availability of coastal amenities, coastal opportunities, and thus suppress the sort of like overall flow of people from the interior out to the coast. So we still saw people moving to the coast in response to possible availability of those opportunities well out into the future. And what was nice about this as an agent-based model-y outcome was that we were able to say, look, we don't know what's going to happen, and we're not saying this is what is going to happen, but it's a plausible story under which sea level rise doesn't lead to this coastal exodus, as you may have been hearing elsewhere. So let's be a little bit more critical in what we're doing. And that was the message that we had. And it was so exciting. Someone wrote up a piece about our work. I'd never had this happen before. It doesn't happen for modelers that often. And it's a wonderful piece. And I guess as I'm learning, someone writes the piece, someone else writes the exciting clickbait headline. And so some of my co-authors were a little upset about this, because this headline, like rushing to the coast, the wrong way to adapt, wasn't really the message of the paper. And for us, it was this cue that, when you're trying to share information in a model, all models, and agent-based models in some ways in particular, because they tend to be big, there's just a lot in there that's hard to communicate, unless you were part of the model building process. And for us, it kind of highlighted the importance of good model communication through the process of building it. I'm going to make a claim, and it needs an asterisk, but models are useless if you don't know what's in them. Now, that's not entirely true. I don't know how the forecast gets made from day to day. I still use it, right? I have this internal model in my own head of when I see this in the forecast, this is what it means for me, because I go back to it every day and I have years of experience with it. But for things like this, where we're kind of making a prediction for something way out in the future that hasn't happened yet and may not happen, we don't have that internal model. And unless we really have a good, well-grounded understanding of all the assumptions that are in there, it's not that valuable. Because as good coders, we can make anything happen that we want. Whether it fits with the data or not is another question. So in the new work that we're doing, new applications, and this is work that's joint with Nick here, along with Alex DeSherbin and Fabian Kachi at Columbia, we're trying to take a more knowledge brokered approach. So we're structuring our model develop around sort of three-stage intervention with non-modeling stakeholders, where first we kind of outline like, what are the key questions that people care about, and what are the processes that we all believe are important in order to inform those questions. Based on that work, we can go back and turn a conceptual model into a working computational tool to bring back in our stakeholder groups and then say, if we mutually understand what's here in the model, we understand what's been used, what are the right scenarios and experiments to ask of this model? Again, from which we can step back, do our computational work, get some outputs, and say, all right, well, since we all understand what's in here, in theory, what do these outputs mean? And this is not a random splitting of things. It's a sort of a careful division and isolation of disciplinary work on the one hand and interdisciplinary interfaces on the other, which is written up. There's a nice paper by Catherine Grace and Benjamin Zaitchik and Siddiqui. It came out a year or two ago talking about just this importance of making use of protected disciplinary processes within big interdisciplinary studies. So I want to show just a couple of slides of some of the early work that we've done here. This started in spring of this year in Senegal, where we kind of landed from this workshop process on a couple of key questions. So one is sort of what are the interventions that we think might best moderate the influence of weather and climate on rural spaces? But then secondly, what are the kinds of interventions that are going to lead to more resilient rural communities in the longer term? So out of this work, we spent some time building this conceptual model. If you wanted to play with this and click around, it's at this link up at the top, Dakar_model. I'm using the Kumu framework for building causal loop models, which is kind of fun to play with. But there's kind of more here to digest than you reasonably could be asked to do. But there are a couple of hubs that are important for us in thinking about what we'll focus on. So first is this sort of rural mobility decision-making space, where we're looking at the things that motivate people in rural spaces in Senegal to maybe stay where they are or move into urban spaces. And then we have a sort of a similar looking space over here. This is an urban mobility decision-making space where some people will end up staying here, some people will move internationally. But what came out of this sort of modeling process with our group was that a real focus on improving rural conditions in the short term, and then as well the sort of role of like, what are people's aspirations for later in shaping what they choose to do. So we had discussed, for instance, well, what if we make more urban amenities available in a rural space? What if we have more rural infrastructure investment, more approaches to improving economic diversity, more schools, for instance? And that can do a lot to make rural spaces a great place to be in. But and then as you come out of, say, a high school that wasn't there before, maybe the opportunities for you for the next stage in your life aren't there. Maybe they're somewhere else. So maybe in the longer term, the investments that we make end up leading more people to leave. So what this requires of us is to do a better job in MIDAS of building in this theory that I mentioned, capabilities and aspirations framework. So what MIDAS currently is good at doing is saying, among these different things I think I can do, which is the best for me? And what we need to get to is saying, among these things that I think I can do, what would I then be able to do afterwards if I did them? And then look more broadly at that set of decisions, which is easy for me to say. Computationally, it's a lot more challenging. It's sort of like a tenfold increase in the computational requirements, which again, as we're in this AI revolution, maybe that doesn't matter anymore. But that's the task for Nick and I over the coming months. So here's where here's what we have at our disposal to make this application work. It's a bit of a data poor environment. We have one round of the World Bank's Living Standards Measurement Survey, which was conducted over 2018, 2019. And so wonderful data set that has in it a number of the things that we need. It has details on labor sector participation, where people were working, how much they were earning, how much they were saving, how much they were spending. It's a great little model on what people are doing. It doesn't have mobility, unfortunately. In the 2013 National Census, we do have a good signal of mobility. We also know where people were working, and so there's a nice comparison we can do there. But we don't have the details on what they were earning, how they were spending things. The World Bank did a remittances and migration survey a few years prior to that. We have a little bit of mobility data there. But one of the things you discover when you study migration is that not very many people migrate. So it can be a real challenge to get good data sets. So most of the respondents in this particular survey happen to be households that aren't moving. We do have a nice annual time series of demographic and health surveys that give us labor. And we have this really interesting one single region long-term study of migration and health, so we have a long-term record in this one space of how people are moving. But these are all just kind of like, you know, different parts of a map, and we don't have all of it. I'm not going to talk about the sort of environmental data side just now, but just to sort of highlight the struggles that come out of this, we don't have mobility data and income data in the same time period. And importantly, I made a point of sort of showing this, you know, the way we make decisions. We have past experience leading to a future decision. We don't have anything like that, right? So I don't know anything before 2013 on economic conditions that may have motivated moves in 2013. These are all at different administrative scales. We only have time series for one of the things we might care about, which is the jobs that people are taking. We only have time series on mobility for one particular space. So it's all just a mix of things that are imperfect. One thing I will say, one little joy that came out of this is that it's very easy to get a very basic model up and running using this LSMS World Bank data. It's a wonderfully well-curated data set, which means that anywhere else that has a similar product, we can set up a model application very easily. So if anyone's interested and wants to work in another country space, lots of cool things you can do fairly easily. But there's a bit of a task for us to sort of dig in and see what's in there. So taking that utility data, it's a little bit blurry here, I'm so sorry. It's not as blurry on my screen, but you're all sitting over there, I'm sorry. We're able to look at the range of incomes by sector. And so these are the range of different employment opportunities. Red dots are rural spaces, blue dots are urban spaces. We're able to look at diversity of household income. And then we're also able to look, and this is for one particular example of an administrative space in Senegal, where along different education levels, how income improves as a function of access to education. And then when we look overall for the whole country in Senegal, we see, well, a bit of a mess, but a little bit of a pattern. And what we ended up deciding to do was to simplify down, and instead of having 20 different income classes, we have skilled trades, service industry, and professional classes, as well as agriculture, aquaculture, and small enterprises, which cleaned things up for us a little bit. And then when we look across Senegal, we see this nice, clear pattern where for several of those income classes, going to school puts you in a position to earn more, and some of them it doesn't. And so generally speaking, it's agriculture and small businesses. Education doesn't lead you to do better there. Where you do better there is just by having more money and more space. But from this, we're able to build a simple submodel and get things going. So here's, you know, we have a toy model running for Senegal looking at where people move over time, and this is based just on that LSMS income submodel, a population estimate from the 2013 census. We have additional data on mortality and fertility, but there's a lot that's not there. Okay, like I could sit down, we could eat and chat, I'll tell you everything that's missing. But broadly speaking, there's work to be done to calibrate this to something meaningful. And as well capture some of these other things that I started off by telling you were important. All this is mobility in response to access to income. But we know that the way we save, the assets that we have, infrastructure in the places that we are, matter in shaping whether we move or not. And none of that's in there. So we have some work to do. A quick picture of what this looks like. So this is one particular modeling run over, each time step here is about 3 months. So there's 4 time steps in a year. This looks like this is about a 40 or 50 year modeling run. And what happens? We start the model up. Agents, I hold them in place for a little while to learn a bit about the system, and then we allow them to move. And then they, over time, reach this sort of like dynamic equilibrium. Now, what I'm going to show here is how well correlated their destinations are. So if I look at the sort of matrix of flow from one space to another, I'm looking to see how well correlated the sort of relative flows are in this time period versus this time period and this time period. So in that last 30 or 40 years, they're pretty well calibrated with each other. Moving a bit earlier, there's a reasonable calibration of, again, or correlation of what they're doing here is reasonably similar to what they're doing here. And then back at the beginning, there's almost no relationships whatsoever. So I guess all I'm trying to show here is that what we get over time is, over about 40 years, we reach this dynamic equilibrium of people moving in response to this very particular snapshot of income opportunity that we have in this 2018-2019 data set, which is a bit of like an absurd thing to do because, again, we've had people responding for 40 years to one set of conditions, and we know things change. We just don't have the data for that. Now, the thing for us to do next is set up some careful calibration procedure. And with MIDAS, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of pieces, a lot of things to calibrate to. And so the approach we take is it's something called an approximate Bayesian computation. We pick some set of outcomes to calibrate against. And so imagine it's something like migration flows. We set ranges that we think are reasonable for all the different parameters that we don't know to calibrate, pick random numbers from them, and run the model thousands and thousands of times with these random values. We look at how well they do against reproducing the outcome we care about. Maybe it's migration flows, maybe it's something else. And then we pick the small number of them that did really well. We use the values of those calibration parameters that we see in those high-performing runs, and those become the range that we apply then for the next round. So we kind of plug that back in and repeat and repeat and repeat. This is kind of like a simple version of ABC. And I want to show you kind of where we are, because it's a little bit of where we're stuck at the moment. We've tried using the migration flow data we have from 2013. And this heat map here is showing, again, I don't know why it's so blurry. It's almost like it's trolling me. I mean, I can see it so clearly on my own screen, but that's okay. These are receiving spaces, and these are sending spaces on the y-axis. So what we're seeing here is this third column over. This is a space called Diourbel. It's an administrative region. It's one of 8 regions in Senegal, and it's receiving a big share of migrants relative to the year before. So we asked, or we didn't ask, the census asked where were you a year before, 5 years before, 10 years before, and it allows us to construct these 2 matrices. So in the particular year for which we have data, Diourbel was this big receiving space. And what's interesting is when we look to where, comparing where you are now versus 5 years before, it's still there as sort of like a spike, but you don't see nearly as much of it. What you do see is much more international migration into Dakar, which is probably, if you haven't spent time in Senegal, that's the place you've probably heard of. It's the capital region. All this to say that for whatever reason, there's this anomaly here where in the year before 2013, like lots of people were going to this space, and it wasn't necessarily as true 5 years before, but it was in 2012. And when I take a look at our 2018 and 2019 data, so this is looking at our professional trades and service jobs and our agricultural jobs, here's Diourbel. So in no way by the average earnings or the number of jobs in any sector is Diourbel like remarkable in any way. And training a model on our 2019 data would never give us that spike that we saw in 2013. Which isn't to say that the data's wrong or that the model's wrong. It's just kind of highlighting this challenge if we ever want to reproduce this stuff. Like we're not going to have the data all the time to explain what was going on in 2012 in Diourbel. So we've spent some time working with our modeling stakeholders to say, well, what should we do? And we've kind of changed strategy. We're going to be trying to qualitatively reproduce patterns of cyclical migration and seasonal migration that we know happen in rural spaces in Senegal, and use our ability to reproduce those patterns as a measure of how much we trust other things in the model. That's kind of the best case that we've worked out. But what I want to do is kind of draw on that and pivot for the rest of the time that I have to sort of think a little bit more critically about what we can do with data and data gaps. So migration flows are one example. Lots of things are like this. They're dynamic. They are a response to some set of underlying stressors that themselves are dynamic. And often what we have are these data cross-sections that might be at the wrong time or just aren't going to let us see the dynamics that we might want. And in truth, we might spend a whole bunch of money to get a time series and completely miss them as well. So all this to say in this slide, like for a lot of the stuff, we just might never have the data that we think we would want to reproduce the things that we're trying to model. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we do with and without data. So if you give me a minute, and I'm hopefully moving through this quickly enough, you start to flag, just let me know, and I'll skip over things. But I want to present a simple model of modeling. So work with me. Imagine this rectangle here as all of the processes and drivers that lead to some activity, A. And then let this other rectangle be all of the different outcomes that we might have of that thing A. Okay? Now we might be building a model, and that's this little white space, and we don't know everything, we don't care about everything, but there's some set of processes that we care about. We leave the rest of it not modeled. And within that space, maybe some things we measure and have data on, they're known. There may be outcomes that we've been able to observe, and those are somewhat known, and we can work backwards through a calibration procedure to sort of fill in the gaps of things we don't. Okay? With this calibrated model, we might choose something to vary experimentally, change a policy condition, change access to something else. And then from this model framework, develop some set of outcomes that hopefully has some overlap on things that actually happen. This is the scary part of modeling. You might never get there. But that's my basic model of modeling. All right? And there are a lot of different ways for this to play out. Different models that model different components of the drivers that matter could give you different results. Bigger models might give you a broader range of results. They may not. A lot of variation here, but this is my simple model of modeling. So I want to use this to sort of hone in and talk about these two different parts of the data problem. So there's the behavioral and input data, things we might want to know about how people make decisions. And then there's outcomes. There's the things that we actually observe people doing. Trying to get this stuff is hard. So collecting like survey data, experimental data, it's expensive. It's very hard to be representative. It doesn't scale very well. And then the other sad thing is that it's really difficult to go back in time and pick up all the things that you missed. Outcomes data, possibly maybe more scalable. So this is like, observing what people buy in markets, right? We have data on what people bought. We can observe what people did to the land. We don't necessarily know why, but we can sort of see it from space. We can observe where people moved. We can sort of follow call data records. There's a lot of things that we can observe easily as outcomes. It's difficult to attribute them to what we're doing. And from an adaptations perspective, of course, we still can't go forward in time. We don't know what people are going to do. So where things haven't happened yet, we run into this more intractable problem. So I'll talk just a little bit about these two things in turn. I've spent a lot of time in this former side, like trying to learn things about what people do. And the challenge is people often can't tell you. There's this inconvenience that people are not jars of answers that you just tip out. It's difficult in many ways because, for instance, people may not remember what they've done. People may not feel comfortable revealing to you what they've done or how they think about things. They just honestly may not be aware of how it is that they came to make their decision. Or it could be that you're trying to get at something that hasn't happened yet, and they don't know how to think about this unfamiliar experience. And we have some cool tools that can help get around some of this. We can do high-frequency surveys and kind of keep in touch with people regularly. We have cool tools for getting at sensitive responses, like randomized response and unmatched count techniques. And then there's sort of like this world of what we call games or framed field experiments that can help kind of tease out how people are making decisions in hypothetical situations if it's a thing they may not be aware of or haven't experienced yet. They're cool, but I want to put them just a little bit in their places. We've done some work with high-frequency surveys where we've had, well, go back 6 or 7 years, we had to give people smartphones because they just weren't out there yet. Nowadays, most parts of the world, people have access to smartphones, but we pay people for their responses, kind of like ping them all the time and say, hey, how you doing? Did you go to school today? Did you go to work? Were you sick? Did you, how are things going? And you're kind of trying to move from like a painful 6-hour survey that no one likes to like just little bits of bothering people 2 or 3 minutes at a time over longer periods. And what we found, kind of staying in regular contact with people and asking about work and illness and shocks and food and consumption, is that generally speaking, when people have planned to do something, they can recall it reasonably well. If you ask people how much time they spent working in running their irrigation system or doing land preparation, they probably planned it. They may even have hired people to help them, and they can generally recall long afterwards how much time it took. But for the things that just happen, like I went out and I bought this thing, or my kid was sick and we had to stay out of school, but the sort of like shock experiences of life, people don't recall them very well, and you get a lot of gains by asking people all the time. But unfortunately, again, it's really expensive. It can be difficult to do. In the same experiment that I presented there, we honed in on this particular dimension of reported well-being. And here we sort of asked people measures of, how happy do you feel? How anxious are you? How satisfied are you with your life? And with this set of measures, we asked this every week for about a year. We looked at, could we predict this? Could we build a good model of this? And the answer is maybe. The advantage is here, instead of having some point estimate, we have this whole distribution of what people report. So we have kind of like a shape of people's well-being. And that ends up being pretty helpful. The data, so if I'm looking just at sort of the mean reported satisfaction and the variation in reported satisfaction, I get these nice 4 clusters. And this silhouette plot here is a measure of how well things assigned to one cluster fit that cluster versus another one. And as long as we're up around here, we're doing pretty well. I know these are close together, but there's this nice kind of story here of people who always give you high, I always put 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10. People who always report low, and then in the middle you have people that are always reporting 5, and then you have this sort of like the sailboats up at the top, like sometimes I'm a 9, sometimes I'm a 3. This ends up being really instructive for when we try to model behavior. So when we try to build these models, and I'm not expecting you to read any of this horrendogram, even when you can read these, it's too much data in one space. But I want to focus attention on a couple of things. Importantly, we found that the models that work best to explain well-being were different for our different groups. So one example is here, this particular time-varying experience of having had a bad shock. And overall, across all of our groups, we didn't have a significant effect. It was so surprising. Like, really? You think shocks would matter? But it turns out, when you can break things apart, they do matter. So for those groups who are in the middle, so our sort of indifferent or our ambivalent groups, you have this strong negative effect. But for those who are on the sides, who are either always 10s or always 1s, you miss that time-varying experience of a shock. So being able to sort of look at the shape and group people by the sort of distribution of their experience really helped. There's one other dimension here when we looked at time-invariant factors on well-being. Men overall statistically were less happy, and married people were overall less happy, which is going to be a hard thing to report. I think some of this is like expectation bias and possibly women in the sample sort of feeling that they were expected to report higher happiness than they were feeling, but it ended up not being a thing that we needed to explain, because as we broke out into this group, we see, okay, what we actually see is that it doesn't explain anything, or we do see that men may be unhappy, but marriage makes things better, which is a much easier result to publish. So out of this, again, this is all just to sort of say, like, it's the shape of X rather than the point estimate of X that can be helpful in explaining what's going on, however expensive it may be to get at. So great. Bother people all the time, you can learn a lot. And we have another result, and this is also shared in that folder, where we looked at food and sort of found that, again, the sort of distribution of food calories over a year did a better job of predicting physical well-being than any other one point in time. And we've had some good success with sustained engagement over time in a few different contexts. But again, it's hard to make it scale. And the other thing, too, is that this is still just capturing the things that people experience. There's this whole other world in adaptation research of trying to understand what about the things that haven't happened yet. We've all experienced floods, but we haven't experienced a sea level rise driven flood. We haven't experienced what it's like when I can't go to the neighboring space and have them kind of ensure my well-being because it's happened to them too. Like, that's all new. So they're kind of cool tools you can build, frame field experiments, games to get at things that haven't happened yet. And so these sort of games as participatory tools have been around for a number of decades. They do a lot of cool things. They're great as enhanced learning tools. They're great as research tools. Lots of different examples out there, and I just want to highlight a couple. If this world interests you, there's this nice paper from 2006 by Marco Jansen looking at the role of games in informing models. Around the same time, this very famous paper by Levitt and List came out, sort of explaining what are the things you can and can't expect to get out of a laboratory game. And then much more recently, games as part of a broader portfolio of participatory tools. Again, I can't tell you enough. This is perfectly clear on my screen. I very much apologize. But this is sort of a broader portfolio of how games fit into participatory modeling as an approach to understand behavior. And I want to focus just a little bit on the very specific challenge of taking these great research tools and using them to parameterize a model as a very specific thing. So if I pose the question as, should we do this? Should we use behavioral experiments to parameterize models? My answer is no, don't do it. But I want to explain, because clearly I've done it, and I'm going to continue to do it. It just kind of needs to be sort of put into its place. So I have a short list of concerns, things to be thinking about when we build this. And one is that there's a bit of a struggle to capture all of the heterogeneity that happens in the world and make that relevant in your design. So when people come to play games, they bring all kinds of things in with them. Their identities, their group, how they know the other people they're playing with, their interest and understanding of the game that you're playing, as well as like whatever else happened to them that day on their way in. And so we're trying to find this very specific layer of behavior amongst others, and it can be really challenging. So typically, our constraints lead us to set specific hypotheses, and this, of course, this is what gets your Nature paper published or whichever. Like, how does one specific change in conditions change the outcomes in my game? That's really good social science. It's a good thing to do, good experimental methodology, but it means that we don't get at all the things that could matter in our broad, bigger system. So I've run a couple of games in different contexts. This is a game trying to look at the role of incentives in encouraging alternatives to pesticide use in agricultural spaces. This is another one where we're trying to look at like non-lethal control of animals in a bunch of different settings. It's called Goosebump, which is, the name works on a couple different levels. If you're anyhow, when we built these games, we built them as symmetric coordination games, which is wonderful from a power perspective because we get a lot of observations in a small space, allows us to test a lot of interesting things, but it tells me nothing about power asymmetry amongst large landholders and small landholders, for instance. And so I just want to have a short list here of things that bother me. One is that the goals of parameterization are not really that compatible with the goals of good experimental design. So that's one challenge. Another is that we're limited in how much we can frame a game around the experience we're trying to recreate. So for example, I can't recreate the misery of having to get up at like 1 a.m. and go and change your irrigation gate from open to closed, for example. I haven't tried. I haven't really earnestly tried to make something awful. I'm going with my gut on this, but it's difficult. I also, on the flip side, I can't create how wonderful it is, or to be able to have a job that keeps you closer at home, with your family or access to nature or whatever other thing it is that you value. And so it can be a challenge to know how well the thing you framed in your game is really linked to people's experience, the thing that you're trying to measure. In economics, we talk about incentive compatibility, and the idea of providing performance-based incentives that align what they're doing in the game with how they might treat their job, for example. But that only works so far as the things you're talking about in the game are aligned with sort of economic thinking. It can be really difficult to know whether the scale at which you can provide an incentive really matches well with the way people think about incentives in reality. And it's not easy then to think about how whatever you've been able to control for through an incentive aligns with all the other things that matter. So all this to say, it's just hard. Right? We can't really control very well for all of the non-monetary things that matter. A couple more things. So one is that in any case, you're building something in your game that, it certainly isn't going to be a perfect representation of reality. We probably are familiar with this set of processes. Anyone who's done some work in modeling, you have what's happening in the world and what you believe you've put into your model and then what your model actually does. And so there are a couple of gaps between these bubbles, and sort of shrinking them are two different processes. So getting a better match between reality and what you believe your model is doing is a validation problem. Actually checking that your model is doing what it's supposed to do and shrinking that is a verification problem. But here we have the things that you can get people to perform in a game. And I don't really know what you call that gap, but it's difficult. You may not be able to build a game where the decision processes match what you have in your model, simply because you've only got a little bit of time with people before they get tired. And so you may have to have a much simpler game than the processes you've included in your model. You have this intervention where people come in, they're learning, they get engaged, and they understand the process, and then they just get tired, they get bored, they're done. And so you make strategic choices about what you're going to fit into this block of time that may not be enough to inform your model. So you're not going to get the sort of one-to-one linkages from one to the other. All this to say, so what's good for a game may not be good for a model. And then one last thing that I feel is worth highlighting, we have fast and slow thinking. I know it's got a home here at Princeton, but basically separating out the sort of like heuristic quick responses we have to things we're familiar with. When I run a game that has a condition that people might be familiar with, I expect that to get engaged pretty easily. I'm fine with that. When I introduce some new condition, experimental condition in a game that people aren't familiar with, I expect people to get into this slower deliberative thinking. And that's fine. But the thing is, if I'm looking in a livelihoods decision context or an agricultural decision context, I'm probably looking at questions that people would tackle, over periods of weeks or months, not necessarily in a minute or 2 minutes or whatever I have in the game context. So I'm not confident that we're tapping into the same sort of brain hierarchy in the span of 30 seconds that we might be in a real decision. So I don't necessarily know that when we surprise someone in a game, it tells us anything meaningful. Okay, so having said all of this and complained about all the things that I think are wrong, what do I think we can learn? So one is just recognizing, as good social scientists, that whenever we present something to someone, we are co-producing how they respond from the instrument we've given them. And if we're being careful then, we don't treat any one response as a truth, right, or as a point estimate, but what we do is try and make good controlled comparisons, controlling for all the things that we can think of. And so often, again, the difference that we observe in people's responses between two particular experimental conditions is the finding. That's the interesting thing. And it's up to us to think about, what does that mean for my model? It's far less convenient from a parameterization perspective. But again, if you can think of how can I match that pattern in my model, then you're doing well. All right, so one just last thing, and then I'll wrap up. I want to look at data on outcomes. So that's this other side of things at the other end. And I want to imagine, imagine a big model where, imagine we never, you couldn't get funded, and it is hard to get funded to do data collection. Imagine you had no data on how people were making decisions. All you could rely on were things that you could pick up from the outside. And so these might be things like call data records, how phones move over space. Or you might look at, I'm drawing from people that I know, really exciting advances in the last few years with the Sentinel satellites, where you can pick up not just that this land was cropped and then not cropped, but you can pick up that they were planting this in one year and then they switched to plant something else in another year on this tiny little sub-acre plot. It's pretty exciting what you can pick up. You can get signals of abandoning land and people moving on to do other things. And this sort of just fits into what I kind of think of as sort of social sciences from space. Right? There's so much more potential to do this now than 10, 20 years ago. It's pretty exciting, but it's still a challenge because you don't know why people are doing things or how to separate things out. So with this, the challenge comes that the more different pieces you're trying to calibrate with one outcome, the more you have what's called an equifinality problem. And so meaning there are lots of different model parameters that can give you the same outcome. And you can't easily resolve what they are. So the way we typically handle this is something called pattern-oriented modeling. And so this is brought over from the field of ecological modeling by Volker Grimm 10 or 15 years ago. And the basic idea is we're not just going to try and calibrate to one thing. It's not just migration, but maybe it's migration and labor sector participation. Or it's all of these things broken out by age and by gender. Or it's assets, ownership, or it's spending. It's lots of different patterns at different scales to get a better match and narrow the range of, many models might fit one thing, but a much smaller number of models are going to fit all 5 things or all 7 things, et cetera. And where I want to kind of tie back to my picture in the beginning in AI is that we're kind of at this neat point where we can take that just the tiniest bit further into what's relatively new. You may be familiar with this term, inverse generative social science. And so this is this world where not only are we trying to, in the absence of data, match model parameters to some outcome via pattern-oriented modeling, but actually try and match model structure. And in fact, allow model structure to emerge itself, be generated in response to how well a model performs in a calibration procedure. So So this is drawing on tools like genetic algorithms and genetic programs, which you may or may not be familiar with. But the basic idea is in any context where you have a problem you want to solve, and being a little bit more right leads to a measurable improvement in performance, against a loss function or fitness function. Anytime you have that, you can rely on selection processes to help you get there. So I'll show an example that, the first time I used this example 10 years ago, it got gasps in the room. But again, of course, we can make images with a prompt now, so it's maybe not that exciting. But imagine you had the task of fitting data. Someone just gave you a bunch of outcome data, a bunch of input data, and said, figure out the model. We can just make a bunch of random models, and we can let the models that perform well cross over and mate with the other models that perform well and see what comes out. And over time, let their children solve our problem. Do you believe me that this can happen? So here's an example. This is generation 1. This is the best performing model in this simple toy where we have a bunch of input variables we're trying to solve for y. These are our observations. Our best model, still a terrible model. But when we run this, I just got it on a cycle underneath, so here we go. Starting very quickly, look at that. So within a few generations of our high-performing children, given the opportunity to reproduce, we can get really, really close in reproducing our outcome. So this is a silly little toy. But imagine that you were able to specify, I know this about my system, and I know this about my system, but I know nothing else. So please allow characteristics of the environment, characteristics of the agents, diversity of the agents to emerge in response to some genetic program that is set up to allow those tools to come together. It's very real. It requires a lot of computational capacity, but we're there now, right? We've got a lot of potential to make this happen. So why I think this is exciting is it lets us go to this very different way of thinking about modeling futures. I don't think we're ever going to have good data on future possible outcomes. But where we don't have that data, we can ask very different questions. Instead of trying to model, doing our best to reproduce flood outcomes based on what people do now and see what that means in the future, we can construct future scenarios of a world where everybody buys insurance and does make structural adjustments to their houses, and in another world where they don't do that, where everybody retreats from the coast. We can use this sort of high-tech scenario analysis to then say, what are the model solutions that lead us to scenario A versus scenario B? And then what are the common features of solutions that get us to the world where everybody insures versus the one where nobody does? And then we can, again, being good social scientists, make that comparison, right? And say, what's different? What are the features of model solutions that lead us to the world where everybody's insured that we don't see in the other solution or the other scenario, in the world where everybody retreats? What's missing there? What's the difference? And so again, we're always going to keep trying to get data, but where we can't have it, I think this is going to be a nice, again, it's sort of like a new take on an old approach. Scenario analysis has been around for decades, but here's our opportunity to be really kind of high-tech and AI about it. And I think it's got a space in the future. So okay, this is my last slide. I think I probably went on a little bit too long, and I appreciate your attention. But just to sum this up, so back to migration, we've been doing it for 140 years, a lot of experience doing it. But it's really changed. It changed 50 years ago with demographic theory. It started to really change with agent-based models 20, 30 years ago. And now with sort of modern computational capacities changing even further. We're always going to be limited by our access to data, whether it's thinking about how people make decisions, how they consider different adaptations, or whether it's just observing what they actually do. There are things we can do, great, but we're always going to be a little bit limited. And where we don't have these things, I think the sort of future of inverse generative social sciences, sort of high-tech scenario analysis, could be really cool. And I think that's it. I think I'm over time, so I'll leave it there. Oh, yeah, I can take questions. Sorry.
Let me ask you a question first.
Sure.
I was interested in the slide where you showed the three groups and how they react to the middle group, which is the satisfied group.
Yeah.
Which you said that's a group that doesn't react to shocks.
Sure.
You don't have to show it. I
Okay.
have a question about it.
Yeah.
Do people not react to shocks because they're satisfied, or are they satisfied because they don't react to shocks? And can you build that into the model?
Maybe. This is part of what makes what is it like? there was this paper that came out earlier this year, the emotions numbers paper that we just came out, sort of trying to deal with this, like how is it that, how do we interpret how people report their feelings when the scale isn't an absolute? So I don't know. I think it's an interesting question to dig into.
That's something to do with risk aversion, but if you can figure out why people are or not risk averse, you probably make progress in that. But let's not get held up.
Sure. Sure.
My question is about this, the last part of this talk about machine learning capability. And I'd like to underline that it's quite, it has some dangers in that way because managing to predict previous data, previous outcomes, doesn't tell you anything about if the model is predictive.
Sure.
If it can actually tell you something about the future. And the advantage of simple models that are not, I believe both predictive, but the advantage of simple models are not black box machine learning process is that you do understand the components of your model and which parameter is doing what, which is not the case anymore when you have a perfect out of the black box machine learning model that gives you a perfect description of your data set. It doesn't. This one doesn't tell you anything about the future, or it doesn't have to tell you anything about the future. And you would need at some point to have a version of the model that is super simple, where you control all the parameters and try to understand the mechanisms behind the mechanisms that led you to having this data set.
Sure. No, I appreciate the point. I should clarify as well. I don't mean to be advocating like a machine learning approach. All right, because absolutely, like when you have your forest of trees or whichever in a machine learning approach, you don't know anything about them, right? The sort of next step up that IGS, that inverse generative social science gives you is it's still you landing on solutions that you can understand and explain. It's just kind of making use of selection processes and big computational power to get you there. So it's kind of like and I'd be happy to talk further, it's sort of a next step above what you get from machine learning. But absolutely, the other point that you make is, again, we can't predict the future. No one's ever going to predict the future, like in a real sense. We can only ever interpolate reasonably well and extrapolate poorly. And so to the extent that the set of people who adapt in the future and the reasons they adapt haven't happened yet, we'll never get that. But it's just kind of our best attempt at exploring the space of what are the different mechanisms that could emerge and how likely do we think those things are.
Thank you for the great talk. I actually not familiar with teaching this model, although it's types of models, so we could follow. I have a very technical question actually, because this is something I think about a lot in my own work. I was wondering, like, how do you actually determine that the shape of the food consumption is the driver and not the food consumption itself? Not just that.
Sure, yeah, from our, I still went over it, so I wanted to talk way more about that particular result, and I knew I had to cut something, so that was the first of my darlings to lose out here. But basically, we ran a set of models, and we looked at people's reported physical well-being, and there's a set of standard measures that you see in health surveys of like people's ability to walk a certain distance, lift weights above their head, certain things like this. And we looked at how well we could predict those. And we ran separate models on their reported consumption at every single different interval in our survey, as well as the sort of like means and variations of access to calorie over time. And it turned out that like variation in access to meat calories, as an example, was an important explanatory factor of their overall well-being. Now, we don't necessarily believe that it's variation in that last year that led to their ability to do things or not, but really that as a proxy for conditions they would have had access to over earlier intervals in their life that led to that. That's our best chance to sort of reach back into the past. But that's the approach that we took. And the paper that in which we reported that is in that shared folder if you wanted to dig into it. So.
Thanks.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. Since I'm also a agent-based modeler, I was pretty interested in your framework, and I was wondering, I think your model was kind of based on the utility portfolio, then have you ever looked at the kind of people who are opposing to kind of utility portfolio, like kind of trapped population who are in the really bad state but not really leaking from other places? Have you ever had a chance to look at those things in part of the model?
So meaning like people whose decisions are not necessarily voluntary, but who are sort of stuck, right? So yeah, I mean, in a way, and this is an interesting question for modeling, like as it relates to forced displacement on the other hand. So there's people who like don't move because they can't. There's people who get pushed out because they have to. In some sense, it's that part of the modeling process is, I mean, it's simple. They do or they don't, right? What's interesting then is to figure out within the space of choices that they make. So what do they do if they don't move? Or what do they do if they've been forced out is where I think there's a bigger role for something like MIDAS. Sort of a sub-answer to that is that we had this interesting experiment in the paper that I shared where we looked at trying to unpack this sort of like trapped population process. Because in the end, there's people who don't move, and sometimes it's because they can't, and then sometimes it's either because they don't want to, or in our case, we found that you can have people sort of like making smaller investments in place to help them stay in place, and then you get this sort of like increasing mooring, or attachment space where I've invested enough to stay. And I think there are interesting analogs or parallels there to things like, like you compare the Kyoto Protocol and the Montreal Protocol and how like a giant step versus a baby step in terms of the shock that you experience leads to like a different decision to go or not. It's a bit of a wander from your question, but I'd be really glad to talk in more detail.
I wanted to ask about the scenario building that you mentioned. When you do that, are you using any particular methods to facilitate those conversations, foresight techniques, or anything in particular?
So that's our next step, and I'm not trained in that area, and so if you had advice on specific different approaches to making sure that you get the ideas out that you want, and different approaches to focusing people, because this is this challenge with any kind of participatory thing, right? Like all this work goes into choosing who to have in the room just to even get yourself started, and you have to kind of start with a rough idea of the question. So there's this iterative process of like, what are the rough ideas around which we want to frame things in order to get the right people in the room, in order to get the focus questions that we think are, it's a lot, and we have not thought that far into what are the specific tools to make that happen. But if you have advice, I'd be very glad to hear them.
So let's have one more question. Otherwise, let's thank Andrew again.
Thank you very much.